Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program with an eye on the deteriorating China-U.S. relations. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered a speech last week seeking to build what he called a broad anti-China alliance. Washington Post reported he has coordinated 4 major speeches against China recently since June. LA Times also reported that Trump wants to have an alliance to oppose China and is starting to take shape, according to the report. The alliance may range from Britain to India, Japan, Australia, and can even include some Southeast Asian countries. But some suggest those names are not necessarily consulted before this idea is even put in front of the public. So what kind of alliance is it? Will it really work? Will it really come into being? I asked those questions to our panelists from both sides, China and the U.S. For more about the so-called anti-China alliance, we have Professor Shen Dingli from Shanghai, from the Institute of International Studies, Fudan University. In Washington, D.C., John Sitilides, principal at Trilogy Advisors. And also in New York, Daniel Russell, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Is there something called the anti-China alliance going on in the United States or advocated by the United States, Mr. Russell?
Well, I don't see a global anti-China alliance genuine, and Mike Pompeo is probably not the person who could put one of them together. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of alarm and resentment about many of China's policies. You know, you see the polling in a number of countries, and it reveals a very sharp growth in negative attitudes towards China. We see that dramatically in the United States, but I don't think that there is an anti-China alliance, but I don't think that China is winning hearts and minds around the world either.
Okay. Professor Shen, when there is not necessarily an anti-China alliance, as Mr. Russell observed correctly, but it does not necessarily mean there's no motivation for some in Washington not to form that kind of alliance, apparently.
Well, the fact U.S. Is not able to organize such an alliance does not mean some in Washington, D.C. do not want to do it. Naturally, they want to coin a new term to distinguish China from Chinese leadership, the party. I think quite a number of countries have some problem with China for some issue, South China Sea, Hong Kong, pandemic, etc. But they all want to talk to China in a diplomatic way, in a respectful way, to help resolve this issue or to reduce their concern through cooperation.
Mr. Sitilides, some suggest that the U.S. has been trying to advocate America first by this administration in power right now. Well, at least there's still 5 months to go if the election presents another administration. So will the U.S. have the attraction and the core competitive edge to form any kinds of alliance with it from now on?
It's a very important question, Tanya, that you ask. And I do believe that the U.S. is capable of marshaling relationships in order to be able to deal with what many see now as a common adversary. Foremost, that the U.S. is forging closer ties militarily and diplomatically and economically in Asia, with Japan and South Korea, helping those 2 countries resolve their bilateral differences. There's a perfect example right there of how the U.S. is leading this type of a coalition, hopefully not in a necessarily formal way, but because right now there's a perception of a common threat in Asia.
Okay. Professor Shen, as Mr. Sitilides suggested, creating a common enemy, for example, China, could help, according to what I just heard, the U.S. to form some kinds of alliance or some kinds of partnership at a time when its geopolitics is not necessarily that much appreciated by the rest of the world. Is that how it works?
I would say it's quite complicated. The U.S. is not satisfied with many things China is doing. But still, many countries would like to work with China for trade. They want China to buy more. And China is buying more, and China has committed to buy 100 billion US dollar more this year and next year from the US as the outcome of the first phase of China-US trade and economic agreement made in January 15th this year. And other countries want also China would buy more. So I think some countries want to get the benefit of US squeezing China, but they don't want to take a side. As the Singaporean leadership made it clear, U.S. has provided prosperity and security in the region since the end of the Second World War, but still Singapore and many ASEAN countries do not want to take side. They hate to see China-U.S. would collide, and they don't want to take side for a coalition of allies that the U.S. wanted a friend to take side. They would be very difficult to take side.
I see. Mr. Russell, you have rich knowledge about this region, and you have served in various administrations in the State Departments as well. Tell me more about what you thought about the earlier question, whether the U.S. would still be able to have the power and the soft power to bring others on board.
Well, the United States retains an immense amount of influence and soft power, sticky power, even though, as you point out, the framework of America First isn't exactly a banner that other countries can easily rally around. But if the Trump administration doesn't entirely have the capacity to persuade other countries to join together in pushing back against problematic behavior by China, China has the power. You know, the United States pushed the UK very hard to reject Huawei. And earlier this year, London decided to ignore that and to use Huawei after all. But in the aftermath of the COVID experience, in the aftermath of the Hong Kong national security law and so on, the government changed its mind and banned Huawei. We are seeing countries that are resistant and are concerned about China's behavior for their own reasons, not because Donald Trump told them to be. I think it's absolutely correct, as Professor Shen pointed out, that the countries in the region want to have the best of both worlds, but they don't want to have the worst of both worlds.
Professor Shen, many say China and the United States only added up to about 40% of the global GDP. There are another 60% of the global GDP out there watching what's going on between these two countries, the biggest powers, quote unquote, in the world. What do you think, after watching over the past few months or 2 years interactions between the two, that the others should take note in their little notebook about the nature of each, and also about a hard choice they have to make about how to be independent, not to be dragged to any side?
Well, the reason China-US in total can account for 40% of the world GDP is due to globalization. China joined the WTO, US and as an advanced country opened the market for China to access, and hoping China would become a market economy eventually. So China get boosted significantly due to the international welcome, embracing. Meantime, US also increased its economic development. I think China and US still share fundamental interest to have win-win, but how the two countries can find a balance? China may win a little less. US would win a far more. So I think the two countries are negotiating.
So do we have to have a lose-lose, or actually we could still have win-win to various extent for the two countries? That's the question Professor Shen asked. Mr. Sitilides,
I think they can be win-win, especially in trade. We still would like to see China and the United States fulfill the terms of the Phase 1 agreement that came into existence in December of last year. We'd like to see potentially a negotiation of Phase 2, the economic devastation that's been wrought on almost every economy in the world as a result of COVID. But I do think that it's very much in the interest of the consumers and the societies in both the United States and China to keep the trade relationship as robust and growing as possible for both the U.S. and China. Okay. And I'm not of the opinion that the U.S. is concerned about who's number 1 and number 2 in terms of economic size. I think the U.S. is concerned about what's becoming an ideological concern between Washington and Beijing.
You talk about ideology. That is exactly the issue here, Mr. Russell, that there are many who worried about the relationship being shaped by some in an ideological framework, rather than a framework about two countries, how to deal with one another, so that eventually the ideological framework gonna have its ripple effect, which bring us to the old book of the Cold War. That is the worry and the danger. If I could quote from a New Yorker article earlier about a former U.S. ambassador to China, Ambassador Stapleton, in a recent article suggesting to mindlessly hurl yourself against China is a misunderstanding of the situation in China and in East Asia. End of quote. Stapleton Royal, the U.S. ambassador to China in the 1990s. You know Ambassador very well, I'm sure, Mr. Russell. So tell me about what kind of framework the two countries should really look at when they try to shape this relationship.
Well, Stapleton Roy is a great diplomat and a mentor of mine, and I deeply respect him, and I certainly agree with him. Yeah. I think that just brute force is not the tactic that will benefit either side in the U.S.-China relationship. That said, I mean, we should be very realistic about the level of frustration that has built up, certainly on the United States side, and I'm sure it's reciprocated. The Trump administration began with a national security strategy that defined China in kind of adversarial terms, and the speeches that we've heard from many of the senior officials also have a kind of Cold War flavor to them. I'm not an advocate of that. I don't think that's the right approach. I think the framework has got to be one of, in the first instance, clarity and firmness about the principles that each side is committed to. There is no doubt that there will always be competitive elements to the U.S.-China relationship. I think we have a strong interest in trying to set boundaries on that competition to make sure that it remains healthy and constructive, more of the competition between a sports team than between, criminal gangs. So we want competition on a equal footing, and that requires that there be some consensus about guidelines and about the global order and rules.
Given, if I could follow up a bit, Mr. Russell, the lack of communication channels and real interactions of quality between China and the United States right now, do you think there's a danger with this administration, or at least some members of it, driving this relationship between China and the United States, which has been built for decades, to an extent that there could be hardly any return, even if a new administration came to power early next year?
Without a doubt, there is danger on a number of fronts. And one danger is that even in a Biden administration, where we will see a resumption of diplomatic communication instead of just name calling, and that's important, the problems aren't going to go away. Both sides are going to have to really work at problem solving. And the pool of goodwill has been depleted. The level of suspicion and adversarial antagonism has grown. So negative attitudes, resentment on both sides won't simply disappear. There's a lot of hostile sentiment in both publics that's going to take time to work through. Beyond that, while I believe that both sides have very professional militaries and that neither side wants conflict, not wanting conflict doesn't guarantee that there won't be a crisis or there won't be conflict. And the essence of communication is not yelling at the other side, it's listening to the other side. And you're quite right. I think that we no longer have the strategic dialogues and the mechanisms for effectively communicating or for crisis management. So the rhetoric and insults, that doesn't wolf warrior diplomacy. None of that helps. But the real threat, I believe, comes from a lack of strategic communication between the two governments.
Professor Shen, your response about the kind of framework we should have from your angle and the possibility we can build that kind of framework from now on.
Premier Zhou Enlai, he said, criticism and self-criticism. These days, China and U.S. are pointing to each other, why you are bad on me. Could we also say, I may have some area to improve. Thank you for pointing to me, as for those that is valid, that helps me to reflect. For instance, the U.S. point to China for a fair trade pattern. After beating each other for 2 years, we have to cut a bigger deal. First, I don't think this is China's concession. I think it's China's win. By buying more, China wins more. Because we pay to get nice stuff, beef, agricultural products, and other items, and we enjoy. Otherwise, we have to buy from Australia, other place. Why we cannot buy from U.S.? But by increasing buying from the U.S., we don't need to cut what we buy from others. And the U.S. get more sale, they get more job, more income, more social stability. So we don't need to beat each other for 2 years. We should offer to buy 200 billion U.S. dollar equivalent of goods at the beginning in 2018 rather than in 2020. That would be far more than what the U.S. would expect. So China needs to reflect why I cannot offer this. To beat them, their expectation, then they would be more than appreciated. Second, I don't think there will be no dialogue. Liu He is going to have a dialogue with his counterpart as a part of the trade agreement as planned. And the U.S. Defense Secretary Esper has suggested to visit China, no matter how bad the relationship between the countries, the two military would go, he still thinks he has a mission to stabilize the relationship. We should have this great opportunity, warmly welcome him, humbly listen to his criticism, even we may not agree, but we need to be humble. China and U.S. can do a lot to avoid some nasty incident. China-Japan military have done the incident kind of avoidance mechanism. Why China and U.S. cannot? So I think we still have a lot of room that the U.S. want to do and China may be unwilling to do, but we can take a fresh look to think to do it may be good for China's long-term interest. And now, at the time of very much great turbulence, may be very good for immediate Chinese interest. So I'm still cautiously optimistic. We have not gone to a point of no return. At any time, China-U.S. relationship is not only defined by Washington, it's also co-shaped by Beijing's own efforts.
Do you think that could be the mainstream opinion or belief of the policymakers? What does it take for it to be, both from China and also from the U.S.?
We should prefer to lose face, but to preserve the bridge. This does not show China is coerced by U.S. successfully. This exactly shows the other kind of Chinese showing of confidence.
But Professor, some would say, oh, is that going to make the U.S. compromise? Do you think that's going to make the U.S. appreciate it?
Maybe not.
And then when it's the end of this, they're going to continue to burn bridges, and you're just sit back and say, okay, you just burn it. I watch it. I persuade you not to do it, but if you do it, then I cannot do anything. That's the argument here.
No. I do not say we don't do anything, but I would say if the U.S. would kick out all Chinese students studying in the U.S., we should not kick out all American students studying in China. We may kick out some, but we should intentionally keep at least one. So Foreign Minister Wang Yi has made a very sensible point.
Yes.
Let's be firm and rational. Be firm. We should do tit for tat. Rational means we do not need to do 100% versus 100%. Sometimes we can do more. 120% beating 100%. Sometimes we can do less, 80%. So to do exactly tit for tat is politically incorrect in my view.
Mr. Sitilides, tell me more about what is the solution you have in mind?
I do see more of an ideological base now to this divide, and I think you will see a U.S. and European response that focuses on, as Danny mentioned before, a Leninist authoritarian system in China versus a West that continues to be inspired by individual liberty, by democratic elections, by freedom of the individual to act and operate as he or she wishes within a framework of the rule of law. And this is going to increasingly define, I believe, the U.S.-China relationship. So I would actually state that this relationship will likely worsen in the short term before it gets better. And I hope it's not a cataclysmic event that shakes up leadership in both sides to move it in a better direction. But I think right now we will remain on a downward trend for the foreseeable future.
So what does it take to make efforts on our own to solve this problem that exists in two biggest powers in the world today? One sentence.
Understanding the complaints and the criticism of the other side, listening to the legitimate concerns of the other side is the starting point of a path towards compromise and reconciliation.
I think that's where both countries can look back and see where self-criticism can move them forward in a better direction.
I hope the two sides can understand each other and sympathize each other. I would propose a way to do it. Before presenting a policy, have internal debate, having red team, blue team, to simulate the other side before presenting a well-received, possibly a well-received policy. That would be at least self-destructive.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. I learned a lot.